stupid old man, you are not welcome for Christmas." The words hit me like a cold gust of winter wind. I felt the echo in the walls, sharp and hollow. My son's voice, angry and dismissive, carried more weight than any slap ever could. The air felt thick, heavy with tension, every corner of the room holding the sting of his words. I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I simply smiled, a calm smile, deliberate, quiet. One that carried patience and observation, the kind of smile that says nothing yet signals everything. He kicked me out, shoving me toward the door with force. The sound of the slam echoed down the hallway, reverberating like the start of a storm. I straightened myself, kept my balance, and walked to my car. Each step deliberate, each breath controlled. Calm in the face of chaos. The cold December wind hit my face as I closed the car door. The engine roared to life beneath my fingers. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead. I drove home slowly, purposefully. The night felt longer, the streets quieter, but inside me, a different kind of tension brewed a calm. Thrilling anticipation. As I drove, I imagined their laughter, their smug faces thinking they had won. The arrogance of youth always blinds them. They never see patience as power, quiet as a weapon, or observation as a force. The suspense had already begun to coil, invisible but tangible, growing with every mile. I arrived home. The house was silent. The lights flickered faintly, a soft glow through the windows. I stepped inside, letting the warmth wash over me, letting the calm of my presence fill the space. Outside, the night continued, unaware of what was unfolding within these walls. I didn't call. I didn't shout. I simply went about preparing for the next step. One phone call, one small action, was all that was needed. The thrill of anticipation wrapped itself around me, a quiet, patient force, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Hours passed. The clock ticked, faint and insistent. The suspense built slowly, deliberately. Every hum of electricity, every creak of the floor, every flicker of shadow became part of the orchestration. Every heartbeat seemed louder in the calm stillness. Then my phone vibrated. A single notification. I glanced at it and didn't react. Patience was a weapon, and I had only begun to wield it. Outside, snow fell lightly, muffling the streets, hiding the unfolding tension from the world. The next morning brought with it a quiet sense of suspense. I sensed the ripples moving outward from the small call I had made. The consequences were already in motion, subtle at first, but growing. Like dominoes lined up with perfect precision, ready to fall at the slightest touch. By evening, the first ripple reached them. I didn't watch, I didn't gloat. I simply let it unfold. The thrill of suspense, the cinematic tension of inevitable consequence, was its own reward. Their arrogance, their laughter, their dismissal of me, they were about to meet a lesson far heavier than any insult. And then came the missed calls. 33 of them. The buzzing, the ringing, the notifications, they all arrived at once. Each one a whisper of panic. A crescendo of shock. They had no idea how fast the consequences had found them, or how carefully the chain had been set in motion. I remained calm, seated in my living room, the faint light of the lamp casting long shadows across the floor. The suspense had reached its apex. The thrill of control, quiet but absolute, filled the room like the final notes of a symphony before the crash of the climax, and I smiled again, quietly, deliberately, because the lesson was only beginning. The next morning, the sunlight crept through the blinds, soft and almost innocent. But inside, the air was charged. I could feel it, the quiet pulse of suspense wrapping itself around the house like a living thing. Each vibration, each small creak of the floorboards, every distant car passing outside carried weight. The night's events were just the overture. The main act was about to begin. 30-3 missed calls still blinked on the screen. Each one screamed urgency, panic, and disbelief. Their arrogance had evaporated overnight, replaced by confusion, fear, and the first real hints of regret. The thrill of watching consequences unfold quietly, without raising a voice, had a weight all its own. I moved slowly through the house, deliberately. I didn't answer. I didn't act. I let the suspense grow, building with every second. Every small sound in the room, the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, the faint rustle of paper magnified the tension. It was almost cinematic, like a slow zoom in a film, capturing the minute tremors before the storm hits. The first text arrived. My son, panic bleeding through every word. He didn't yet understand, couldn't yet see the pattern of what had been set into motion. The thrill of suspense is in watching someone grasp reality too late, in seeing the slow erosion of their confidence and control. I didn't read it aloud. I didn't show my reaction. Calmness was the weapon. Patience was the thrill. Every second of delay tightened the coil. They had assumed that laughter, mockery, and cruelty without consequence. They had assumed that dismissing me, shouting, kicking, and humiliating would go unanswered. And they were wrong. Hours passed. Notifications kept coming, each one a small drumbeat in the symphony of consequence. My son's frantic attempts to call back only added to the tension. Each attempt failed, each ring unanswered, another tiny reminder that control had shifted. Suspense thickened, pressing down on them, though they didn't yet know the full scale of what awaited. I poured a cup of coffee, slowly, deliberately. Steam rose, curling in the morning light. Every movement was deliberate, cinematic. Calm, composed, deliberate. My actions contrasted sharply with the panic that now coursed through the other side of the line. It was a study in control versus chaos. By late morning, the consequences became more tangible. Unexpected holds, warnings from the bank, locked accounts, errors they didn't understand, ripples from the single call I had made the night before. The thrill of suspense was almost unbearable to watch. They were trapped in a web they hadn't seen, unable to predict the next thread to tighten. Their arrogance, so evident just days before, had dissolved into disbelief. Their laughter, once cruel and careless, replaced by frantic gestures, whispered questions, and the panicked clatter of keyboards and phones. The cinematic tension reached its peak as the walls of assumed control crumbled around them. Every time my phone buzzed, I didn't look. I didn't need to. The orchestration was precise, the timing perfect. The thrill wasn't in the act itself, but in the patient, deliberate unfolding of consequence. The suspense had become almost tactile. I could feel it in the air, in the soft hum of electricity, in the shadows stretching across the floor. By afternoon, they realized the gravity of the situation. The arrogance that had led them to dismiss me, to throw me out, to laugh at my quiet patience, was gone, replaced by confusion, fear, and the first stirrings of remorse. But the thrill of suspense still had room to grow. The climax wasn't yet complete. The final lesson was still pending. I watched them struggle from the safety of my living room. Every movement, every glance, every subtle sign of panic recorded in my mind. The suspense was cinematic, like a slow-motion scene in a movie, each micro-expression magnified. I didn't need to intervene. The calm had already done its work, and as the hours passed, the full scale of consequence became undeniable. Bank accounts locked. Immediate alerts. 33 missed calls piling onto dozens of notifications. Panic setting in like ice spreading through their veins. The thrill of suspense had become a living, breathing force in the room. I finally poured another cup of coffee, quietly, deliberately. My calm presence contrasted sharply with the chaos unfolding in their world. The suspense, the cinematic tension, the thrill, they had all been built perfectly, deliberately, over hours of observation and patient waiting. By evening, the lesson was undeniable. Arrogance, cruelty, mockery, they all carried weight. And the thrill of suspense, patiently constructed, had delivered justice far more powerful than anger or confrontation ever could. I sat back in my chair, letting the tension linger, savoring the moment. Patience, calmness, and deliberate action. These had been my weapons. The suspense had done its work, and the thrill of watching consequences unfold quietly was complete. Tomorrow, they would wake fully to the reality of their arrogance. And the lesson, carefully constructed over days of tension and silent orchestration, would be unforgettable. Night fell again, the house bathed in soft pale light from the street lamps outside. Shadows stretched across the walls, elongated, crawling like silent observers of the tension that had been building for days. The suspense was thick, almost physical, pressing against every surface. Wrapping around the rooms like a heavy curtain dot, my phone vibrated quietly on the table. I didn't touch it. I let it sit. The thrill of suspense comes from anticipation, from watching events spiral naturally, without interference. They didn't know yet how far the consequences had reached, how absolute the ripple effect of their arrogance had become. I could hear the faint rustle of movement outside. My son pacing. His wife whispering, panicked, voice low but trembling. Each sound carried weight. Each gesture was amplified by the silence and the stillness of the house. The suspense was a living thing now, thick in the air, making every breath deliberate, every heartbeat noticeable. Then came the next wave. Alerts began cascading across their phones, every transaction flagged, every account frozen, multiple warnings of pending actions. The realization hit them like a sudden cold wave. The thrill of suspense was electric. They were trapped in consequences they couldn't control, consequences that were invisible until they erupted fully. I remained seated, calm, observing. Patience was the weapon, calm the armor, silence the force. They didn't understand yet that the lesson had been in motion long before they realized. Every laugh at my patience, every cruel remark, every mocking gesture, it had led them here. The suspense of the unknown now became the thrill of inevitable truth. Their panic escalated. Doors slammed, chairs scraped, hurried footsteps echoed. My son checked again, frantically, his fingers trembling over the screen. His wife's voice was tight, each word a whisper of fear, trying to rationalize the chaos she had ignored, the consequences she had mocked. The cinematic tension had reached its zenith. I rose slowly, deliberately, walking to the window, hands clasped behind my back. The suspense followed me, every shadow along the wall seeming to stretch and bend with anticipation. Outside, the street was silent. Snow or rain muted the world, isolating the drama inside. Every detail heightened the thrill, the flickering light, the soft hum of the heater, the distant buzz of notifications. Minutes dragged, each one deliberate, each one stretching the tension further. And then the first audible sob. My son's wife, realizing the magnitude, the absolute weight of their arrogance, their dismissive cruelty. Panic transformed into fear, and fear into an understanding that laughter and mockery carry consequences far beyond imagination. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Silence had been the orchestration of this entire act. The suspense had created a stage. The thrill had set the players in motion. And now, the climax was unfolding. Finally, my son sank into a chair, face pale, hands gripping the edge like a lifeline. His wife crouched beside him, tears streaked down her face, her chest heaving with shock. The realization hit them fully. Their arrogance, their cruelty, their laughter. They had no defense, no escape. I moved to sit opposite them, calm, deliberate, every movement measured. The suspense was complete, the thrill fully realized. The weight of inevitability hung in the air like thick fog. Their phones buzzed again. Notifications, alerts, warnings. They barely glanced. The lesson had been delivered, not in anger, not in confrontation, but in calculated, patient, deliberate consequence. I leaned forward slightly, letting my eyes meet theirs without words. The cinematic moment of reckoning stretched, long and unbroken. The thrill, the suspense, the emotional tension, it had reached its apex, and as the night deepened, I realized the most powerful form of justice is not loud. It is quiet. It is deliberate. It is patient. And it is inevitable that they would remember this night forever. The arrogance that had filled the previous days was gone, replaced by humility, fear, and respect. The suspense had taught its lesson. The thrill had delivered the moral. I exhaled slowly, letting the silence carry the weight of the story. Patience had been my weapon. Calm had been my shield. And in the quiet, cinematic aftermath, the consequences were absolute, inevitable, and unforgettable. The morning light broke gently through the curtains, soft and pale, almost serene. But inside, the house still vibrated with the tension of the previous days. My son and his wife remained huddled together, faces pale, hands trembling, their minds racing through the consequences of their arrogance and cruelty. The suspense that had been building finally reached its conclusion, yet the thrill lingered, thick and undeniable. I remained seated, calm, deliberate. I didn't rush them. I didn't speak. Every second they spent in the grip of realization deepened the lesson, etched it into their consciousness. The cinematic tension hung in the room like a tangible presence, wrapping around them, silent but overwhelming. Notifications still buzzed on their phones. Alerts, warnings, restrictions, all undeniable proof of the consequences they had ignored. They stared, frozen, as the reality of their actions settled fully upon them. Their arrogance had evaporated. Laughter had vanished. Fear, humility, and shock filled the space where confidence once stood. Finally, my son spoke, voice shaking. I don't understand." Every syllable trembled with disbelief and regret. His wife clutched his arm, eyes wide with panic, realizing too late the weight of their previous actions. The suspense had transformed into horror, the thrill into absolute understanding. I leaned forward slightly, letting my calm presence dominate the room without words. Sometimes silence is louder than any argument, and sometimes observation teaches lessons that shouting never could. The patience I had shown, the single call I had made, the quiet orchestration of consequence, it had done more than any confrontation ever could. The cinematic tension was still palpable. The shadows cast by the morning light stretched across the room, highlighting the stark contrast between calm authority and desperate panic. Every creak of the floor, every subtle movement, every faint flicker of light seemed to underscore the inevitability of what had unfolded. I finally stood, moving slowly, deliberately, walking past them. My steps were measured, calm, controlled. The suspense, the thrill of consequence, the moral clarity, they had all reached their apex. I could feel the weight of inevitability pressing upon the room. My wife moved to my side, serene and composed, her presence reinforcing the lesson. No words were needed between us. Her quiet authority amplified the impact of what had occurred. The moral was simple yet undeniable. Arrogance, mockery, and cruelty carry consequences far beyond imagination. And patience paired with deliberate action can be a force more powerful than anger. My son lowered his head, understanding dawning too late. His wife's hands trembled, eyes wide with remorse. The cinematic climax of suspense and thrill had delivered its lesson. And now the resolution unfolded naturally. I spoke softly, deliberately. Sometimes the quietest actions carry the heaviest consequences. And sometimes patience is the sharpest form of justice. My words hung in the air, heavy with inevitability, echoing the climax of the suspense that had built over days. They remained silent, absorbing the weight of the lesson. The thrill had passed, leaving only clarity, humility, and reflection. The arrogance that had once filled the room was gone, replaced by understanding, fear, and the knowledge that actions, even small, Dismissive ones always carry consequences. The room was quiet now, the cinematic suspense resolved. The thrill had delivered its message. Justice had been served, not in anger or confrontation, but in calm, deliberate, patient action. And in that quiet, I understood again the power of patience, the force of calm, and the inevitability of consequence are lessons that even the arrogant cannot escape. As I looked at them one last time, I realized that this moment, the suspense, the thrill, the quiet orchestration of consequence would remain with them forever. The lesson was complete. The moral had been delivered. And sometimes, silence truly is the loudest answer.